I even love the smell of books. Hello, welcome to Sundoku, the podcast for eclectic readers everywhere. I'm Annie Hastwell.
And I'm Kath Keneally.
So Kath, literary news today as we record, it's the Prime Minister's Literary Awards. The winners get $80,000 tax-free, and I'm not being commercial by mentioning that. Mm-hmm. They certainly deserve it, and it's definitely the glory that counts more than that. Michelle de Kretser won the Fiction Prize for Theory and Practice.
I think that'll be a very popular choice.
Today on Sundoku, a chat with author Brigid Delaney, who's written a novel about Stoicism.
And I'll be talking to Mandy Treagus. She's a professor in the School of Humanities at Adelaide University, and she's written a book called The Pacific Tale, which actually looks at books by non-Pacific Islanders like Robert Louis Stevenson and Jack London, to the point where the Pacific Tale became a thing.
They were so intrigued, I suppose, by what they found, and they were being so adventurous and even going there in those days.
And living there and the exotic life.
So a really interesting perspective from those times as well. Mm-hmm. Let's share our Sundokus before we get into that. Kath, what are you reading?
Well, I just took a teetering pile back to the library, but that included the two I've been waiting for, the new Richard Osman, The Impossible Fortune, which is the next in the Thursday Murder Club. He's everywhere at the moment. Wow, has he ever hit the big time? But justifiably so. And of course, the movie's out, Thursday Murder Club, and Slow Horses is out too, the next series. So I've just put down Mick Herron's Clown Town, which is the latest instalment in that, the Jack Lamb and Co. series. And just on the side, when I feel I'm being too frivolous, I pick up Peter Ackroyd's book, The English Soul, which is a history of English Christianity from the Venerable Bede in the 7th century through Julian of Norwich and up to the present. It's pretty fascinating.
Yes, well, for a former nun, possibly.
I think you'd like it.
Oh, really? And my Sundoku is living up to the actual formal meaning of the word, which is an untouched pile of books beside my bed that I do intend to read. But the crossword keeps getting in the way and then I fall asleep. However, I would really love to get hold of, and it's now in the shops, Ian McEwan's latest book, an author who is so wonderfully in touch with where we're heading. And this one's set in the future, 2119, and it has all the dystopian predictions you could imagine, but a glimmer of hope.
Ooh,
I like the sound of.
So.
I wouldn't be reading it otherwise. And Sarah Moss, another author I love.
Me too.
Who there's always a little mystical weirdness about time edge to her books. This one is called Ripeness, and it's set in Italy and Ireland and features the past and the present. Sounds pretty good. And one book I am actually reading, quite short, incredibly fascinating, beautifully, simply written for such a massive topic, is James Lovelock, who was the scientist Gaia, who, put forward the theory of the Earth as a living organism. Yeah. And this one's called Novacene, and of course it's like the Anthropocene, and he's predicting the next age, which he thinks we're rapidly moving into, where machines will really drive everything.
So he's still alive?
No, he died at the age of 103 not that long ago.
Excellent.
Amazing. And now to author Brigid Delaney. She's someone who's intrigued by modern society's search for meaning. She wrote Wellmania, which was misadventures in the search for wellness, and that book and the Netflix series it inspired, which stars Celeste Barber, was kind of a fearless and funny exploration of our modern obsession with everything from yoga to colonic irrigation. But it seems Brigid's found her spiritual guidance in the classic philosophy of Stoicism. We did talk to her a couple of years ago about her first book on the topic, Reasons Not to Worry, which I still see on bookshelves everywhere. That was a straightforward explanation of how the ancient Greek and Roman practice of Stoicism can help us navigate modern dilemmas. But now she's written a novel which takes us further into understanding Stoicism through story. The book's main character is a deeply traumatised journalist who, in the wake of the horrific incident she was involved in, makes a perilous trip to a place called Silver Springs, which unfortunately sounds a bit like a ranch in America, but it's actually somewhere high in the Himalayas. It's a happy, closed society that's run on the principles of Stoicism. And the book is like a conversation between this young woman, the seeker, and the mayor of Silver Springs, the sage. It's called The Seeker and the Sage. And as she told me, that form of novel is a classic format.
Similar in many ways to The Alchemist, or those books that tell you a philosophy within a story. So you're reading a story, things happen to the characters, but while you're reading about the character's journey, you're also getting a big dose of the philosophy. In this case, it's Stoicism. So my character's a young woman who suffers a kind of traumatic workplace injury at the start of the book and recovers and is depressed and despondent with the state of the world. And her boss sends her on an assignment to go to the happiest place in the world and interview the mayor. And she sets off, very much a hero's journey, perilous journey to this remote kingdom, where she's given 3 days to interview the mayor of a community that is run according to Stoic principles. And she spends 3 days with this mayor and they talk about Stoicism. He teaches her, she challenges him on various points, but also things are happening in the village. She's meeting people, she falls in love, she does all these different things that people do in real life, but is learning Stoicism and applies Stoicism while she's there.
And is able to ask all those questions that people have about Stoicism and how such an ancient philosophy from such a simple time can apply to the complicated world we live in.
Absolutely, yeah. She's kind of an interrogator of the philosophy with someone who's an expert.
So what made you decide to go to this form, to revisit Stoicism and to do it in this form?
It made sense to tell the story of Stoicism through the story of a person going on a Stoic journey. And, some of our oldest instincts, our oldest ways of absorbing information, I'm thinking here of things like the Bible. Siddhartha's another example, the Vedas, like everything is told through story. That's how we've evolved. So I wanted to do something that revived that form.
Great idea, because I think a lot of self-help books are prescriptive, really. They have stories within them, but they're coming from the author to the reader, whereas this is actually a very disturbed young woman who's gone through a horrendous experience, but who lives a very modern life with all the issues that she's dealing with, talking them through with someone who has supposedly the answers.
With my first book, it was more kind of traditional self-help, but I haven't been through a serious illness. I haven't been through grief or serious grief, and I certainly haven't faced my own mortality yet. And so the fictional form gives the writer the license to go into areas that they haven't experienced directly. So it actually gave me far more scope to explore cradle to grave Stoicism rather than having the reader being cut off where my experience is cut off.
Tell me about Silver Springs. Is there a fascinating place like a Shangri-La lost somewhere up near the Himalayas, I gather? Is there any truth? There's always been that story of this magical place that exists up there somewhere. Is it based on anything?
No, look, I did a journey a number of years ago to Shan State in Myanmar, and I'd heard a lot about a place even further up called Nagaland, which is untouched, beautiful, all that sort of stuff. And I'd also read, in preparation for this book, I'd read The Lost Horizon, which was a book that coined the original term Shangri-La, and became really interested in that book. It's a fantastic book from the 30s. It was a real challenge to try and create a utopia, like a fictional utopia. There's nowhere like it in the world that I know of. So I had to sort of think about, well, what are the elements? Like, what would make a great place? Like, what would make a place a peaceful place, an interesting place, a beautiful place? And the first thing I thought was, well, it can't have the internet. There is no way a place that is paradise is connected to the internet, because so much of what I think we're struggling with at the moment in society is around social media and around the acceleration of news and information via the internet. I love the internet. Spent most of my career working on the internet, but for the purposes of this book, Paradise has no internet.
And the journalist, of course, in the book has all the dilemmas associated with the internet and all the things that it's created. So it gives such great talking points. One in particular that stood out for me was, and I don't know if this is you as well, she has a luxury handbag rental service that she subscribes to.
Yeah, no, that's not me.
Oh,
I mean,
didn't know such
I do
things
love
existed.
handbags. I do love handbags, but I don't have a rental service. But it's the thing of, you see a bag or you see something you like online, and you rent it so you can then do it, Instagram or TikTok of yourself with the item, but you can't necessarily afford it. So it's all about how you represent yourself in modern society is often more important than who you actually are as a person. So I wanted to get that across.
One of the other things that really struck home for me was when the sage, the mayor that you talked to for 3 days, was talking about time and how so much in our society is about saving time. But he says, well, what for?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, a lot of the time stuff comes from Seneca, who really went, Seneca, the Roman Stoic, really went back time and time again to, we hoard our money, but we are very lavish with our time. This lavishness includes a lot of waste. So, being on social media, being just passively consuming things. And we often we're often working in jobs and doing things with time because we think we'll have more time at the end to do what we really want to do. But we're not necessarily promised extra time. So I think our relationship with time is as confused as it was back in the ancient days.
In that we don't know what to do with it.
We think we have endless amounts of time. We often don't plan for how we want to spend time. So if people retire, they don't know how to spend that time, or they put off retirement thinking that they've got endless amounts of time when in actual fact they may be killed the following day. So our relationship to time is often confused.
How challenging is Stoicism for a modern person to accept, though? To accept all that awareness of death and the rest, non-materialist lifestyle?
I think it's really hard for people to accept because, I mean, you have these multi-billionaires, the oligarchs who are obsessed with life extension. And it's like, well, what do you want to extend your life for? You're in life now. Like, life is happening now. Why aren't you using your life now, particularly while you're younger, to actually do what you really want to do? Like, why are you seeking more at the end? What are you going to do with that? And I wonder if people are obsessed with longevity not because there's more stuff they want to do, but because our culture hasn't actually, we don't talk about death unless you're religious and it's incorporated into your religious beliefs or liturgy or whatever. You're not even thinking about it. You don't want to think about it. When people die, it's a horrible shock because it's like, oh my God, I thought this person would be here forever and now they're gone. And so, yeah, we think we can probably outmaneuver death through science, but I think that's unlikely.
Now, one of the accusations levelled at Stoicism is there's something a little bit joyless about it, about, imagining your loved one's dead and, keeping emotions pretty well under control. In this book, your character has a bit of a love affair towards the end. What does she learn from that?
She learns that life is for living, and that, Stoicism, as you said, doesn't have to be joyless or anything. Like, if you have an attraction to someone, go for it. You can't control the outcome. You can't control if they like you or not. But the Stoics celebrated all that was natural, and all that's natural includes having a sense of humour, falling in love, attraction, all of that sort of stuff. So they said go for it, but just don't get upset if it doesn't work out.
Ataraxia, a lovely state of mind. Is it something that could you describe it first, and is it something that you've achieved?
So ataraxia it's kind of the Greek word for equilibrium or, a sense of well-being that's just ticking away, sort of like homeostasis in the body. Everything's within balance. So not too high, not too low in terms of mood. It's not something you achieve, like you set and forget. Like, basically, ataraxia is a moment-to-moment project, really. Like, it's, moods can change on a dime, and ataraxia is about trying in each instance with each input that you get not to be too reactive, to, tamp down a little bit of, the high emotion, but also not to get too despondent when things don't work out. So I see it as a lifelong project.
So at Silver Springs, when the journalist gets to walk around a bit, there seems to be a lot of mixing and chatting and doing going on. Now, how much is that an example to us in the modern world of what maybe we're not doing enough of?
Yeah, so the Stoics were people of action. They were people of, they weren't the kind of chin stroking type philosophers that we think of when we think about philosophy. The Romans in particular were very engaged in political life, and in civic life. So, and they also loved society. They believed that our nature, they kept on coming back to this word nature. Our nature is to be social. Our nature is to be friendly. It's to be hospitable. It's also to have times of quiet and contemplation, the yin and the yang. So you have time alone where you're journaling, you're reflecting, but then you back out in the world and you're engaging and feasting and talking with people. You're arguing with people without getting upset. You're able to have connections with people that you might disagree with. I think it's a really great model for how to kind of cope with now.
Especially when that's exactly what we don't do, it seems.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So in my kind of utopia that I've created in this book, people do disagree. It's not a kind of monoculture where everyone thinks the same. It's that they agree to respect the people they disagree with, to not try and change people, to model the values that they love. But it's certainly not attacking or demonizing people who have a different position.
So how deeply have you been changed by writing both of these books and by immersing yourself in the ideas behind Stoicism?
I mean, I think I've changed a lot. It's a spiritual practice to write the books. So the books mean that you go back to the original text, so back to Seneca, back to Marcus Aurelius, back to Epictetus, and returning to the primary sources reinforces the ideas. By creating characters, I'm thinking about how Stoicism would apply in different circumstances. So that then seeps into my daily life. But it's like anything, it's like going to the gym. You kind of have to keep on it. Otherwise, it's easy to fall back into being reactive, being overtly kind of, I mean, emotional is the wrong word, but being overtly affected by things, getting angry. So yeah, Stoicism is like, I don't know if I'll ever do another Stoic book again, but I'll definitely be practicing this for the rest of my life.
Inventing your mare, who was the fount of all wisdom and able to explain, that must have been an interesting psychological exercise for you to go deep down, create this person who he almost is part of your own subconscious talking to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a friend called Hal Crawford who was helping me with the edits, and he really, in the final edit, suggested that the mare needed to be a lot not nastier, but a lot sharper than he was already. So the mayor underwent kind of a big personality change between drafts.
He was quite challenging at times, yeah.
He was challenging, and that was Hal's idea, to kind of make him a bit more of a hard ass. And that helped with, I guess, the tension between the two characters, because while I'm teaching Stoicism, I also want you to be engaged in the story of these two people having a conversation and this woman's journey. And so it had to do these multiple things at once. And I think having a kind of interesting mare like that is a good thing for the reader.
Yes, not just imparting wisdom, but keeping you on your toes. And it seems to me it was a little bit what Stoics must have been like, sitting and arguing and discussing, but always in a constructive way.
Absolutely. I don't know spoilers, but you see at the end of the book, that is, something real develops between those two that started off quite kind of antagonistic.
And how do you feel about living in the modern world? How hard is it to apply these lessons once you leave Silver Springs?
Well, that's the challenge, isn't it? It's easy to apply Stoicism when you're in a beautiful place where everyone's kind of agreeable. But a Stoic wants, a real proper Stoic wants to be tested. So they would want to be living in our like fairly fractious world, because they'd be like, oh, this is a great challenge. I'm going to see if Stoicism works for me if there's a social media pylon and I get attacked by people whose identities I don't know, or if, I'm suddenly facing 13 interest rate rises on my mortgage and it's very stressful. A Stoic would be like, okay, bring it on. Let's see, if I can keep my cool, when I'm financially stressed. So in some ways, a Stoic would actually prefer our times to a kind of idyll.
Plenty of challenges there.
Definitely.
Author Brigid Delaney talking about her latest book, The Seeker and the Sage, hitting the bookshelves as we speak. You're listening to Sundoku, the podcast for anyone who browses bookshelves wherever they are.
And now on to our next and also slightly left of field book on Sundoku today. It's The Pacific Tale, short fiction from 1890 to 1950, written by Mandy Treagus. And in fact, it's looking at books by non-islander authors. Robert Louis Stevenson, Jack London, W. Somerset Maugham, James Michener, names we all know from back then and even further back. So it traces the rise of the Pacific Tale as a popular genre. And here's Mandy.
I've been interested in writing about and from the Pacific, and I did notice a trend in a bunch of writers following Melville who talked about the Pacific in various ways. They all went there, so they had varying levels of experience. So I started off with Robert Louis Stevenson, who famously moved to Samoa and died there in 1894. And then I moved through a range of other writers, most of them sort of known for other things, like Jack London. He did a voyage inspired by Melville and Stevenson on this boat he had built. It's a sort of a luxury yacht called the Snark. Jack London, Somerset Maughan. Oh, actually, I left out the Australian. Louis Beck, who was big in the 1890s. And then my final one is James Michener, Tales of the South Pacific, which, from which the musical South Pacific came, and it perpetuated many of the myths from the 19th century.
And so are you interrogating our notions of the Pacific?
I am, but I'm also interested in the Pacific Islanders and the Pacific itself, and trying to get beyond the idea of Western projections really onto it. So I do finish the book by looking at two writers from the Pacific, Albert Wendt, who's from Samoa, and Apele Hauofa, who's Tongan, but who grew up in New Guinea, and the way they overturn, in fact, this tradition and take it somewhere else, and lay the ground, both themselves as writers, but then lay the ground for others who have followed. So there are particularly a lot of poets. There's a very rich group of writing that's come out, particularly this century.
So the Pacific Tale, short fiction from 1890 to 1950, so that doesn't include Melville, doesn't include Moby Dick.
No, but Melville's actually more interesting in the Pacific for his first two books, Omu and Taipei. Taipei is the first one, really. It's based on his own experience, but it's quite exaggerated and extended. And when he jumped ship in the Marquesas Islands on Nukuhiva and found himself with a shipmate in the valley of the Taipei and was, terrified all the time that he was going to be eaten by them, but never actually saw any cannibalism, but was sure it must be there. Mm-hmm. And the idea of the Pacific Belle in the character of Fayaway from that book has been it was already in place from explorers' accounts of Tahiti in particular, but this idea that Polynesian women were sexually available to any white man who rocked up, he certainly confirms that, and all of these writers are in dialogue with Melville in some way.
Okay.
And very conscious of him too. So Stevenson went to Nukuhiva, had 2 or 3 voyages in yachts around the Pacific, and he went to that valley in the steps of Melville, and then Jack London came in the steps of Melville and Stevenson. So there's a self-consciousness about their engagement with these places.
And is there an evolving critique? Do they become more aware of doing it?
Yes and no. And Stevenson is probably the most aware because he moved to Samoa. He was conscious about trying to find a place that had a living culture, that was doing well, that was kind of independent, had its own idea of itself in a way that somewhere like the Marquesas, that had been devastated by disease, wasn't able to do at that stage in the same way. There was just so much lung disease there. The population was decimated.
So your book would have to be a social history as well as
it really
a literary
is.
history, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and I've come in on a few angles, or labour, what we've commonly known as blackbirding, or at the time in the 19th and into the 20th century. I've got a bit of a focus on that, and London's written some stories about it where he's both supportive and critical. There's a lot of ambivalence around race.
What are the stories by Jack London?
One of them is called Mauki, which is about a Solomon Islander, because the thing that probably as Australians we think, we know about blackbirding and labour in the cane fields in Australia, 63,000 people were brought to labour, and
Kanaks.
yeah, they were known as Kanakas, which is actually the Hawaiian word for person, but it became widespread through whaling as a term for Pacific Islanders, now considered offensive, so Australian South Sea Islanders, as those people prefer to be called. There was also labour moving across the Pacific, so there were plantations set up in Tahiti, in Hawaii, in Samoa, and other Pacific Islanders were brought to labour. And this happened in the Solomons. Mauki, this character, is kidnapped from Malaita in the Solomon Islands and taken to another island to work on a plantation, which was growing coconut for oil that was used to make soap in Sydney, under the control of the Lever Brothers Corporation, which was one of the first multinationals. So you start getting into the way labour and capital are moving across the world.
Yeah.
And London satirises the Lever Brothers and their Sunlight Soap with the Fulcrum Brothers and Moonlight Soap. So
Fairly transparent.
it's pretty obvious, yes.
Yeah. Are they all considering the Indigenous peoples in their stories as the other in that Sadian kind of way?
It's really mixed, and Jack London he's fascinating about race because he's sort of got this Anglo-Saxon Superman idea going, and then he gets to the Solomon Islands and he gets sick. They get everything, the crew. They get malaria, they get all kinds of skin diseases, they get all this, and he's just so sick he has to have surgery in Sydney. So, because his account of the voyage of the Snark is all about, this went wrong, so I did this, and that went wrong, and it's triumphalism,
Yes.
particularly him teaching himself to navigate when two successive captains turn out to be not very good. So his view of race is really mixed. He did write a novel on this voyage as well called Adventure, which is pretty appalling. It's very much in support of plantations and labour and shooting anyone who doesn't follow orders. And then there's this story, Mauki, which is much more interesting because Mauki resists and he keeps resisting, and finally he triumphs over this sadistic white man who not coincidentally is German. So there was a bit of, the Germans are bad, everyone else is fine in the Pacific. So that's interesting. But London was also really interested in will, in people exercising their will. And so Mauki is admirable because he manages to get what he wants by persisting. And there's a grandmother character in another of his stories, which I haven't published anything on. It's a fantastic story called The House of Mapuhi, which is about a cyclone in the Tuamotus off Tahiti, to the southeast of Tahiti, and this grandmother persists through all these terrible things, this cyclone, sharks, being stranded on an island, blah, blah. She triumphs because of her will. So he concedes agency to people who display will.
Of the authors that you cover in the book, who do you admire the most? Whose work do you like the most?
Well, I have sat there with that story of London's and gone, this is astounding, especially he uses a lot of repetition. It's an interesting technique, and so it builds up this rhythm in the story. You know, the barometers dropping, the seas coming over the atoll, that kind of thing. So I do think that is a very clever story. But Stevenson, I think, is the one with whom I'm most sympathetic because, you know, he actively engaged in the politics of Samoa and wrote letters to the Times. Oscar Wilde dismissed him for this. Send him out to a tropical location. What does he do? Writes letters to the Times about the Germans instead of writing a romance. But he wrote a footnote to history, which is a history of colonisation in Samoa. So he got quite engaged in that.
Where did he die, Stevenson?
He died in Vailima, which was the house he built outside of Apia in Samoa. He had a brain hemorrhage. Opening a bottle of wine. There's worse ways to go.
Worst ways to go. Who haven't we mentioned?
Louis Beck. Do you know Louis Beck, Australian? He started publishing the Bulletin in the 1890s. He's the one actually with the most experience of the Pacific. He'd been a trader. He'd been a supercargo on ships in the Pacific for about 20 years. So he really knew the Pacific, but he really knew it as a trader. And he writes in that Bulletin, the Bulletin magazine, you know, in the 1890s, of short fiction, mostly very kind of masculinist stories. And he writes a lot about white men and Pacific Islander women and all kinds of conflicts. When he's on song, he's very, very good in terms of powerful, short narrative. He did write some novels as well, but they tend to be rather character and sustained plot aren't his strong points. But he was big, you know, in his time, and he was trained in that very clean style that the Bulletin encouraged.
Why did you cut off at 1950?
Well, Michener, I think, is the last of them. He's the last one who's, you know, I think very consciously writing a Pacific tale, as I call them, because his book on which South Pacific was based is it is a collection of short stories. It won the Pulitzer. In the first year they could have a collection of short stories. So yeah, I felt that was the time.
Beyond that, people were a little bit more self-aware, or in the more recent.
You'd hope so. Not always. But I think they were these sort of big, widely read writers.
Yeah.
And it's not that short fiction was the only thing they could do with the Pacific, because all of them wrote novels set in the Pacific. And they all refer to each other. You know, Michener says, if I want to write, I pick up Somerset Maughan and I read the first few paragraphs of...
Oh, is he in there too?
Yeah.
Did you say? Yeah. With what?
Maughan?
Yeah, with what stories?
Rain, which is probably his most famous short story.
Yes, I know that one.
Yes. And it's interesting because it pits this figure of a sex worker against a missionary, the repressed missionary, and does so very powerfully.
Yeah, he was the most consciously shocking. You know, he was out to shock. Don't you think, more?
Well, I think he himself was unshockable.
Yeah.
And so he was a bisexual man. He toured the Pacific with his lover, Gerald Haxton, and I think he saw sides of societies that not everyone saw.
Are you wanting, via this book, for people to pick up those writers again?
I think that would be great, but I'd like them to pick them up in a particular kind of a way. I guess just with their critical eye open. I still think they can all be enjoyed. but with a certain awareness. I think one of the things I have done with the book is used it as a way to highlight issues in the Pacific. You know, the impact of the church, the impact of global labour, capital and labour, some of those sorts of things. And finally, militarisation, which has probably been the biggest thing in the Pacific.
And that was Mandy Treagus. Her book is The Pacific Tale, short fiction from 1890 to 1950.
I'm Lesley. I recently came across in a second-hand bookshop a wonderful book by the travel writer Jan Morris called Conundrum. It's a trans memoir. Jan Morris started life as James Morris. He was an Anglo-Welsh travel writer known for a lot of his books about Venice. In this memoir, he talks about his life as a trans. He started life as a boy, but said that from the very earliest memory that he had, he considered himself to be a girl in a boy's body. But he maintained this as a secret. He was born in 1926, and he died in 2020 at the age of about 91, I think. So he kept this quiet secret. He came from an upper-class, educated British family. He was educated at an upper-class all-boys boarding school, became an Oxford-educated foreign correspondent for the Times and the Guardian in England. And throughout all this sort of very masculine life, he kept this quiet secret that he knew he was a woman, that he was biologically a male, but his gender was that of a female. But the book is a fascinating account of the early years of his life, when he hid his secret, when he belonged to all-male London clubs and belonged to the British patriarchy in many ways, and had this very exciting life as a foreign journalist, where he was the only journalist who went up on the Hillary expedition and climbed to 22,000 feet with the mountaineers and was the first to bring the news of the Hillary Tenzing summiting to the world. He was awarded an OBE for his services to literature and to travel writing. He married at 23. He had 5 children, one of whom died, and he had a very good marriage, and he eventually revealed his secret to his wife, who after they'd had their children completely encouraged him to gradually begin to come out. And at about the age of, I think, about 40, he began the transition, first via hormones and eventually via the famous Dr. B in Casablanca, to becoming a woman. And he became a woman in his 40s, had to leave his all-male club. And then he talks about the whole process of the transition, the joy that it gave him, the way people, some rejected him and some completely accepted him and didn't blink at the process. I found it a very rewarding book to read, and I would recommend it to anyone who wants to read some great literature, because he was a wonderful writer, or she was a wonderful writer. She lived with her wife for 70 years, and there's those glorious pictures on the internet in their garden when I think they're about sort of 90 and 88. He has a son who's a famous Welsh poet now. His family entirely accepted the process, and they sort of lived happily ever after.
And remember, if you've just read a book you loved, why not review it for Sundoku? Just drop us a line at sundokucast@gmail.com.
And after you've listened to our podcast, don't forget to like us.
Thanks for joining us today. I'm Annie Hastwell.
And I'm Kath Keneally. Happy reading. We'll see you next time.
This podcast is produced by 4 book addicts refusing treatment.
Kath Keneally,
Michaela Andreev, Sarah Martin,
and me, Annie Hastwell. Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. If you want to know more about the books and authors featured in this episode, check out the show notes. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at SundokuCast. That's TSUNDOKU cast.